Hello, my name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, um, but I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional home of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression and the Creative School at Ryerson, we are delighted that you are able to join the third in this fall's Center for Free Expression in Conversation series, a series featuring prominent guests discussing important issues in the current political moment, in which democracy is under threat, public discourse on vital matters is fragmented into self-affirming ideological bubbles, which not only when not discouraging interaction altogether, and censorship is increasingly seen as an ally rather than an impediment to social justice. I would like to acknowledge and thank the co-sponsors for today's event, and they are the Edmonton Public Library, the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University, the Milton Public Library, the Thunder Bay Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. Our conversation today features Samir Gandesha in conversation with Charles Reeve, and the title for their conversation is Challenging the Racism in Anti-Racism. Samir Gandesha was born in Nairobi and immigrated with his parents as an infant to Canada in the mid-1960s. He studied at Simon Fraser, UBC, the London School of Economics, and York University, and then did a postdoc at the University of California at Berkeley. Currently, he is professor and director of the Institute for the Humanities at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia. Samir has written and edited a number of books. The most recent is Spectres of Fascism, Historical, Theoretical, and International Perspectives. Samir is also a public intellectual who writes for the Vancouver Sun, the Globe and Mail, the Los Angeles Review of Books, openDemocracy, Art Papers, Canadian Dimension, amongst others. In 2017, he was a Liu Boming visiting scholar in philosophy at the University of Nanjing and a visiting lecturer at Suzhou University of Science and Technology in the People's Republic of China. In 2019, he was visiting fellow in Germany and a visiting lecturer at the Universidade de Sao Paulo, Brazil. Welcome, Samir.
Thank you, Jim. Glad to be here.
In conversation with Samir is Charles Reeve. Charles is associate professor in the faculties of Arts and Science and of Art at OCAD University, where he is chair of liberal studies. He has published widely in the fields of modern and contemporary art, with special emphasis on art's interface with literature. He and Samir have had an ongoing conversation for many years on the issues that are going to be dealt with in this conversation. Welcome, Charles.
Thanks so much, Jim. Great to be here.
Now, for today's program, Charles and Samir are going to be in conversation for the first 45 to 50 minutes or so, after which Charles will turn to the audience to bring you into the conversation. As you listen to their conversation, if you have a question at any point, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, this version of Zoom that we use, you'll see a Q&A button. So if you have a question at any point, just click on that Q&A button and write out your question. You don't have to wait until Charles turns to the audience to ask the question. Just put it in there. And then Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator of the center, will read out the questions as Charles and Samir get to that part of the program. I think that's all I have to say by way of introduction. So over to you, Charles and Samir.
Thanks so much, Jim. So welcome, everybody. Terrific to have you along with us. And maybe I can start by just acknowledging that, like Jim, I am on Treaty 13 territory, as is my cat Radish. And just to explain quickly that my role here is really to sort of be an interlocutor for this conversation with Samir. And maybe just to start, we were having a conversation about the direction that this event would go and the things that we wanted to discuss and what we should call this event, and came up with this title, Challenging Racism Within Anti-Racism, which raises a number of complex issues right off the bat. And so I thought that where I would start is actually channeling an old prof of mine from graduate school named Tim Murray, who I remember very fondly. He was a terrific guy, who in a situation like this would ask, well, why this title and what do you mean? So maybe we can start there, Samir.
Yeah, great. I think this requires some degree of clarification so as not to give the wrong impression about where we would like the discussion to go. But before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the unceded territories of the Musqueam people, and the area that is called Vancouver, British Columbia. I mean, this part of British Columbia is on the unceded territories also of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations, amongst others. So I'd like to just acknowledge that respectfully. And also, perhaps before we get to the question that you posed, Charles, I'd just like to talk for a couple of minutes about where I'm coming from. I think that these days it's really important to provide a kind of context for one's thoughts and one's speech. And so just very briefly, the context for me, and Jim touched upon this a little bit in his very lovely introduction, and that is that I come from a post-colonial world. My family comes from East Africa. They themselves, so my grandparents were immigrants from the western part of India. And one of the critical early moments in my own childhood really was the memory of the expulsion of the Asians by Idi Amin from Uganda. And that provided me with a very, let's say, complex prism through which to view the world, and through which to view questions of race and racism in particular. That was compounded by the fact that I grew up in what was then a very homogeneous part of Vancouver. I grew up in Vancouver, but in North Vancouver. Yep. Back in the 1970s, it was predominantly white, and so I was quite aware of, and I had more than just a passing familiarity with racism. That was only heightened by my exploits playing soccer. I wanted to play professionally. I went to Britain in the early 1980s, probably when the game was at its worst in terms of racism, and I experienced it directly and firsthand. Later, I went to school in the UK, and I was an active participant in the anti-apartheid struggle, and would spend many days camped outside of the South African embassy in Trafalgar Square as we would be kettled by the police. And then subsequently, more recently, I've been involved with the West Coast Coalition Against Racism, which is a sort of successor organization to the BC Coalition Against Racism, which played such a crucial role in combating far-right groups and neo-fascist groups, in particular the KKK, which that they essentially kicked out of the province. So that's in a sense my formation, my background, and as you know, Charles, and maybe some of the other people here in the audience will know that I've recently edited a book, Spectres of Fascism, where the question of racism is absolutely central. So I have both a kind of biographical experience with various forms of racism, as well as a particular theoretical and philosophical interest in the question of racism and how that figures within the world. So I suppose the challenge of racism within anti-racism was sparked in particular by some experiences that I had as the director of the Institute for the Humanities. I've been Institute director for for close to 12 years now. And around 2014, the Institute simply supported a photo exhibition that detailed the similarities and differences between settler colonialisms in South Africa, in this country, and in Israel. And there was, from a particular colleague of mine, a very strong pushback, very strong criticism, and really a kind of command that the Institute not support things like this in the future. Well, you know, of course, immediately.
That was exactly the wrong strategy, but anyway.
Exactly. I mean, if you want to elicit a powerful counter response, that's exactly how you do it. So we had it out over the question of academic freedom. And that's, I think, the moment at which academic freedom wasn't just for me a kind of abstract, though important principle, but something that really had a kind of substance on the ground for me to do my work as the director. And so fast forward to the present, and this past summer, the Institute did something very similar. We supported a conference that was called Dismantling Global Hindutva. Hindutva is another name for Hindu nationalism. And this was co-sponsored by, I think, at least 50 other institutions of higher education, University of Toronto, Chicago, I mean, you know, you name it. The top universities in North America supported this, and it was a very significant conference. But the pushback against this was really quite unheard of. At least I'd never seen anything like this myself. It was the first kind of academic conference to elicit, as far as I could see, a kind of press coverage that we saw in it happened at, you know, the first week of September. It was discussed in the pages of Al Jazeera and The Guardian and so on, because of the kinds of threats that the organizers got and some of the speakers got. I was also threatened in that I had some somewhat menacing emails sent to me, which I think, you know, as far as it goes, wasn't so bad given what other people face, is particularly women faculty. And the Institute's office was vandalized. Yeah. And so this brings me to my point. Okay, this is a long way of saying my concern about certain forms of anti-racism, right? And I think those in particular that are associated with kind of managerial approaches, such as EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, is that they can be weaponized quite easily in the defense of political ideologies and movements like Hindutva. Because what was said to the administrators, and by the way, our administration, actually the Office of the President, got way over 10,000 emails that were sent, I think, by the sort of, you know, these bots, like sort of spam email, right? And they were insisting on the idea that this was Hindu-phobic, right? So this was a bigoted conference that targeted Hindus as a particular religious group, religious minority, and moreover, that because SFU, because the Institute supported this created an unsafe space for Hindu students. This is identical to the language used in 2014 with respect to this photo exhibition on comparative settler colonialisms. This created an unsafe space for Jewish students. There's no mention of, well, what about Canadian students? What about South African students? So it's a weaponization of a certain kind of anti-racism, and then it brings into play as well, you know, the larger sorts of themes today in the modern university, like, you know, the safe spaces and trigger warnings and so on. And I think this is something that needs to be thought through a bit more and discussed. But there's an unwillingness, it seems, to address these things, because simply to raise questions like this puts you, it seems, on the side of the racists, which is not the case. So that's a very long answer to your concise question.
Yeah, well, and I think it's worth mentioning, just for people who might not have memories that go back that far, but that first of all, Vancouver was a very different city in the 1970s than it is now, I think. But also to say that Idi Amin, who's a name that thankfully has kind of receded into history at this point, but that he was kind of widely reviled at the time as one of the most ruthless and bloodthirsty dictators really in the world. So to be expelled from Uganda by him was not simply a matter of being, would you mind, please? I mean, it was a very harrowing context, to be sure. So I think that it may be important to raise those points.
Yeah. If I could just add to that, Charles,
Yep.
I mean, you raise a really good point here, and I would like to make this a further point on, in response, and that is that I think for the Asian community that was expelled, so the Ugandan Asian community that was expelled, and many of whom now since the late 90s have gone back and retrieved their properties and so on, by and large, their fate was quite a happy one. And in this constant emphasis on, this happened to us, we lost everything. Well, we first of all didn't lose everything, because some properties were returned. There were opportunities that were then taken in this country, in the UK, elsewhere. But the African people who stayed endured way worse, right? They endured horrors at the hands of Amin and his henchmen. So that also has to be remarked, And the reason this was actually possible in the first place, it was done under the auspices of Africanization or kind of nationalization, that Africa for Africans. And I think there's some real basis in reality for such a movement, because Asians in East Africa were not without considerable racism. And we're talking now also about Gandhi's legacy in South Africa and so on. I think that has to really be raised, and I think that's an important point, part of this story.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And so I want to maybe start to expand or delve a little bit deeper into what the kind of at a sort of a conceptual level, what is really kind of driving your concern about this issue of, as you say, that you go in a particular direction in terms of protecting the interests of yourself and your community, and maybe doing so, let's say, with all the best intentions, all of that kind of stuff, but the ease with which those mechanisms can be weaponized, turned against you, all of that kind of stuff. And this is an important part of what you're thinking about, what you are thinking about when you talk about the need to really be careful what you wish for in a certain respect, because it could come back so easily to attack you. And that how this plays into some of the things that you and I have talked about and that you've written about, with respect to, in fact, the very categories of race and identity themselves, and the way that, well, if it's a philia of a certain kind, then that's good, and if it's and if it's phobia, then that's bad. But you want to say something different. You want to say that regardless of whether it's a xenophilia or a xenophobia, it's still a form of racism, and it still plays these roles of limiting the perceptions of what it's possible for you to be, and still presents the possibility of that categorization then being turned against you in a certain way. Do you want to sort of tease that out a little bit? What's really at the heart of the concern around those categories for you?
Right. I think that we need to be careful in anti-racism to not maintain a fetishization of the groups that are victimized by racism, and where you want to, in a sense, address this harm that's done to others. And it is a tremendous harm in many different ways: socioeconomic harm, physical harm, the kind of violence that people have to face. And we're very mindful right now of the particular kind of attacks on people of Asian heritage, right? As a result of Trump claiming that this is a Wuhan or an Asian virus that we're dealing with. The psychological trauma and damage that's done via racism is enormous. So I think there's this tendency to want to, identify with and to express solidarity and care for those who are the result of this myriad forms of violence. But I think we have to be careful not to fetishize the other. That is to say, to maintain the subsumption of individuals beneath certain group categories. While now what we're doing is, rather than attaching a negative value to that group, we're attaching a positive value to that group. And that is okay, that is of course better, but it's still a kind of fetishization, it's still a kind of reification, and it still does a kind of violence to the individual and all of her possibilities, right? Oh, you're X kind of person, or you're Y kind of person, right? And it does have to be interrogated as part of an anti-racist agenda. And here I'll draw upon my former and very dear teacher, Atu Seshiotu's book, Left Universalism, Africa-Centric Essays, where he mounts a very powerful defense of not individualism, but individuality as a kind of utopic horizon for our struggles. And I think this is something that I'm very much committed to myself. I think it's a convincing argument that he makes, and I think it's necessary for any kind of anti-racism worth its salt to really move beyond these kinds of racialized categories as part of utopic politics.
Yeah, I mean, it puts me in mind of this really terrific conversation that I was watching the other day. Amia Srinivasan in conversation with Jacqueline Rose, and they were talking about a very similar idea, but with respect to feminism. And Jacqueline Rose made this point that I just thought was terrific. She said, like, either way, it doesn't exhaust the possibilities of who we are. And that's the problem with these kinds of categories, is that they assume that they do exhaust the possibilities of who the people within those categories are. And so regardless of whether you intended, as you say, as an active allyship or whatever, or not, in either case, it has the same effect of promoting the idea that the possibilities of who the people are within that category is exhausted by that category.
Absolutely.
And you just
absolutely, I admire her work very much, and she's a good critic insofar as she is a critic of society above all else. And this is something that's so blatantly missing in a book such as White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which mentions capitalism 3 times. And here, I'm reminded of Max Horkheimer, who says, that if he who remains silent about capitalism ought to remain silent about racism. And I think the same thing, because capitalism does violence to us all. I think it does more violence to others than to some, but it is a structure of organized violence, and so of course that will limit the possibility of everyone in a sense. And I think that a kind of anti-racist struggle without a dimension of anti-capitalism cannot succeed. I mean, for example, how do you talk about environmental racism without talking about the destructiveness of capitalism on the planet? And that's very much tied to settler colonialism. And in a book like White Fragility, I just don't see how that's even possible to begin that discussion, right? So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's such an interesting point, and one would think that by a quarter of the way, a fifth of the way, or a quarter of the way into the 21st century, that this idea would be in wider circulation perhaps than it is. But maybe this is why you know eh, 35 years after Kimberly Crenshaw starts to put the term intersectionality into broad circulation, we're still talking about it and still having to explain what it is, precisely because it's so tempting to see, well, if I just focus on this one thing, this is the root of all of the problems. But it's not. It's much more complicated than that. And I think you're right. The issue of uh, what is the motivation behind a certain kind of a certain kind of othering, a certain kind of uh, um, in ecological injustice, so on and so forth. It's very hard to separate that from the social systems and systems of distribution within which we live, for sure. Um,
Absolutely, yeah. So, but this is another dimension of the possible, inadvertent racism within anti-racism, and that is,
right.
D'Angelo draws attention to this herself. I mean, explicitly, but still, then goes ahead and does it, and that is there's a centering of whiteness,
Right.
which I think is highly problematic. In that, who has the agency in all of this? Well, it remains white people again. They're the ones who have to undo racism. People of color, racialized people, who sit over there and do their own thing, and it's really our problem as white people. And I think this is in and of itself very questionable. But how do we make sense of Hindutva? And I think for those who don't fully understand its project, it's fundamentally Islamophobic. So deeply racist and deeply casteist. Now, if racism is all about white supremacy, then how do we make sense of
Well,
Hindutva? We really can't,
well,
can we? So
yeah.
I'd say decentering whiteness is part of an anti-racism worth its salt. Right?
Yeah, well, indeed. I mean, I think the idea that racism only goes in one direction and has one point of origin, and that it doesn't exist in various other forms, and that indeed all axes of discrimination don't kind of cut across all kind of multiple networks within society. Let's just say. I mean, of course they do, and it radically oversimplifies the situation to suggest, well, if we can just get these people over here to stop doing this bad thing, that'll be great, because they're the only ones who are doing that. Um, so let's maybe talk a little bit about the kind of other side of this. I mean, against uh, these kind of categories of identity, for example. What's the kind of counter term for you? If it's not identity, if it's not some kind of group identity, what's the kind of counter term for you to those categorizations?
That's a really good question, and I think I have a fairly straightforward answer, which is to say that I don't really have a counter term as such, but rather, again, I'd go back to the earlier point that I made and maybe develop that a bit, and that is that I think we run into trouble when we start to make identities into fetish objects, or when we fetishize identity. This is the problem for me. And we can look at different kinds of identities. I mean, we have to try to understand, let's say, identity as a group marker, as a signifier that refers to members of a group. There's always going to be non-identity at work, right? There's always going to be a degree of difference within what is identical.
Right.
And I think this is a big question then. How do we understand the nature of this difference? What are the limits and the possibilities of such forms of difference, which have to do with what we were talking about earlier, right? In terms of what sort of potential might members of these identity groups realize that is quite maybe at some variance from the larger group. So I think there's that. And how does identity, which is a form of, let's say, a kind of discrete form of universality, how is that related to the structure of our societies, which is geared to the production of commodities, the commodity form and exchange value, which is itself a kind of homogenizing logic which negates difference, which negates non-identity, and so on. What's the relationship there? The last thing I would say is that we have to be quite attuned to the way in which not all identities are comparable or alike. And I think here, I think intersectionality is really a very valuable approach which shows the ways in which various forms and systems and structures of oppression converge in particular ways to marginalize certain groups much more than others because of the convergence of gender, sexual orientation, racialization, and especially class. But at the same time, by mentioning class, I think that class has a slightly different resonance here. It has a slightly different kind of dynamic, and that has to do with, I mean, if you're, a radical, want radical change, if you consider yourself something like a radical Democrat, where you have some vision of society as a whole, and not just sort of isolated structures of representative democracy at the various levels, and provincial and federal and municipal level and so on, being the site of democracy, but you say that the whole society must be democratized, then you have to say that class identity, or the class dimension of identity, isn't something that can remain. We must, in a sense, work to the ultimate transformation of class society. We must work to its unbuilding. Whereas other identity markers might, require or might demand, and rightfully so, a certain kind of positive recognition. Class isn't like that. Class ought to be understood as a negative category, right? That insists upon its own abolition as the basis for liberation. So that discussion, I think, that discussion within intersectionality has to be more nuanced. It's not just, added on to gender and racialization and so on, but it's something that should be understood in negative terms. Maybe race itself at some point ought to be abolished. And this is what Paul Gilroy argues, for example. And I think it's very convincing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that point that you make is really important, and that's what I wanted to ask you about that, because certainly, I mean, Paul Gilroy has made that point with respect to race. Jacques Derrida has made the same point with respect to race, that in fact, race is in fact a fiction, which is precisely not to say that people do not have experiences of race, but that his point, and Gilroy repeats this point, that the idea we have that racism is prompted by race. And what Derrida and Gilroy says makes the same point, that we need to, in order to understand what's going on, we need precisely to invert our understanding of that, and to say, no, it is racism that produces race, and not the other way around. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that was going to be my next question, which is to say precisely that. Is there a point at which these categories that tend to be used to fetishize people, and then either to discriminate against them or to sympathize with them, but in either case to frame them within the horizons of sort of a limited category? Is there a point at which those categories need to go away? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a great question, and I think entire books, entire volumes could be and perhaps should be written on this. But what you're referring to in terms of racism producing the category of race was beautifully brought home by the British writer Hanif Qureshi, right? Who wrote My Beautiful Laundrette and I think My Son the Terrorist and some other things, which are really important statements. And he said that, walking down the street, I don't feel like any, I don't have any particular identity or identification, and then I'm spat upon, and then I become wacky, right? Yeah. And so I think it's exactly, this kind of gesture. I think because of the various harms that, as I was discussing earlier, that result from racism, the multiplicity of harms, and I think in D'Angelo's book is not without merit. I mean, she describes concrete situations quite well in terms of interactions between white people and racialized groups where things can be said, things can be done, implied in ways that are hurtful to people. And I think it's the hurt that many people, despite knowing that race is just a false category, it has no basis in biology. It has to do with the way people present, and then also the historical forms of domination that are still very much with us. It's no surprise that the forms of racism in Canada today are the most viciously directed against people of African descent and Indigenous people. Why is that? Well, it's got to do with the long legacies and ongoing legacies and effects of slavery and settler colonialism. Yeah. These are grounded in very material realities, right? So I think one can understand a certain melancholy attachment to race as a category, sure. When in fact I think the utopian horizon should be one that ultimately moves beyond it. However, I think that the situation with Indigenous cultures, Indigenous identities is highly specific and has to do with relations to the land, relations to bodies of water, to animals, and I think that is an identity that has to be treated sui generis. There's something that's quite specific and different there.
Yeah. So I'm glad that you mentioned the D'Angelo book a couple of times, because it kind of gives me a segue to a couple of things that I wanted to ask you about next, which really have to do with, okay, so we have some sense of, let's say we have some sense of what is the problem. And so what I want to invite you to talk a little bit about now is some things about, okay, so what are some strategies, what are some tactics here? And I've got a couple of very particular things in mind. One is an article that you wrote recently that was in Espace magazine, I think, where you talked about basically the idea of deplatforming examples within the visual arts. And one of the things you say right at the beginning of that article, a very brief quotation, but I think it's really, really on point. You say genuine anti-fascism ought at all costs to avoid mirroring core aspects of what it opposes. Easy to say, difficult to do. And so what I want to ask you about in a couple of ways, I take it when you say anti-fascism ought to avoid mirroring core aspects of what it opposes, you mean ought both practically, but also morally, both of those senses. And so I guess I have a couple of questions here, but maybe I'll just start with the first two, which is, first of all, why do you think this? Because certainly lots of people would disagree with you. So why do you think this? And why do you think it's easier to say this than it is to do it?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that we could look at the practical dimensions in a kind of short-term and a long-term sense. I think that you know, and the two, you know, are dynamically interrelated. I think in our practice, we want to mirror the society that we want to build. And if we get drawn into being authoritarian in our response to fascism, what kind of a society are we building? And we also have to remember that anti-fascism, anti-racism, they both can't just be anti. They need to, in a sense, negate the negation and have some vision of a better society. And maybe in having a vision, which the mainstream left certainly doesn't have, they might be able to draw some of those folks who are committed to fascism away, committed to white nationalism, committed to you know, a politics of friend and enemy. And this is understood in kind of ethno-nationalist terms. So in our practice, we have to mirror the society that we want to make. But also, if we are authoritarian in our practice at a tactical level, and you know, strategic level, then how can we build the kinds of alliances that we need? You can't deplatform your way to a coalition politics. You can't cancel your way to alliance building. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So I think at that level, we have to think seriously about the damage a certain tendency within the left does to the left, right? So I think this is, yeah, absolutely key. And another point that I would make here is that if we look at what the far right wants to do today, both when it's in power and when it's working from the fringes, and I'm not just talking about Trump and his you know, calls to his supporters to march on the Capitol and so on. I'm talking about also Stephen Harper in this country. What they want to do is really follow the model of Viktor Orban, which is to destroy liberal democracy and create an illiberal democracy, which is a kind of populist democracy where the executive embodies the will of the people. And this then becomes very close to fascism. So surely the left's strategy isn't to also destroy both the letter and the spirit of liberal democracy. And you do start doing that when you articulate a thoroughgoing skepticism of things like due process. When you start to call into question the validity of elections, why, you know, not the outcomes or and so on, although it could be that too, but just the very process of voting. It's, you know, it's all rigged, it's all bourgeois nonsense, and let's forget about it. That's a mistake, but it's also, it does a lot of violence to those who were injured and were killed and murdered in the struggle for voting rights, which we know in the United States now are in severe danger.
Yeah, it's still going on.
So surely it's not left politics to hasten this destruction, right? But of course, we distinguish ourselves from the liberal Democrats by saying that there's much more to democracy than this, as I was alluding to, right? That liberal democracy needs to be democratized further. That's what distinguishes the left. It isn't to say, let it all burn, because that's a kind of nihilism of fascism. And surely we don't want to go down that route, do we?
So why hard to do?
It is hard to do I mean, there would be two answers to this. The first would be Michel Foucault's preface to Anti-Oedipus, where he says that this could be read as a kind of manual in anti-fascist living. And so one of the things he points to there is what he calls a kind of sad militancy in the left, right? So there's a kind of history of sad militancy on the left, which he seems to associate, and I think, not unreasonably, with a certain kind of tendency in the direction of, I don't know, I know that I would call it fascism, but certainly authoritarianism. And secondly, if we have an analysis that fascism emerges out of a crisis of capitalism, and that crisis is no longer to be thought of as a series of acute crises like the 70s crisis of stagflation, but under neoliberalism it's just an ongoing chronic crisis, right? And if fascism has something to do with that, we also have to recognize that we can't simply escape the conditions of the society that produces fascism. We have to guard against it very, very carefully. So that would be my answer. So there's two different answers, but not unrelated.
So I've got two last questions that I think kind of draw this point out a little bit, and then we can start to turn to the audience and take some questions from other people and bring them into the conversation. My first question is, okay, so you say that we need to avoid mirroring core aspects of the thing that we oppose. And I take it that one of the things that you mean there when you use the word authoritarian, which is basically a thing where an entity says, well, why are we doing this, or why are we not doing that? Because we say so. It must be the right thing to do because it's us, right? And so the will of the people, any kind of due process, any kind of public discourse is pushed to the side because this is what this is what the kind of fundamental point in common of authoritarian and intimate entities across history. So, but is there a point at which you would say, okay, here's a point where actually a little authoritarianism is not necessarily such a bad thing?
Yeah. No, absolutely. This is a crucial question. One sometimes, so my argument or my response to you, to put it in different terms, would be one can't or one ought not to fight fire with fire. And that, as a general rule, should hold. And I think in firefighting, that's probably the general rule too. But there are cases where you, in firefighting, actually have to fight fire with fire.
Indeed.
Right? And I think that holds in politics as well. I think, and this, of course, is a question of violence, right? Because when it comes down to it, fascism is an understanding of politics as war, the existential confrontation between friend and enemy, right? Mm-hmm. That's the essence of fascist politics. And sometimes, when communities are under fire, when they are besieged by their enemies, by the fascists, they have to fight back. They have to fight back physically. And this was a lesson for me. I'm a child of the 70s, and one of the most important historical lessons that I learned, apart from the event of the expulsion of my extended family, were the struggles in Southall in London, which was then and remains a predominantly Indian Punjabi neighborhood. And neo-fascist organizations like the National Front would very ostentatiously and very provocatively and aggressively stage marches through Southall to say, this is our country, this is our city, pardon the expression, but this is what they said, wogs out, right? Yeah. And they were, of course, aided and abetted by the police, who defended them. Mm-hmm. But I think it was the Southall Youth Association, the group of young, predominantly young men in the community, who went out, and they had allies in the larger society, larger community, particularly on the left, Socialist Workers' Party, the Anti-Nazi League, which was really key and instrumental in the Rock Against Racism Festival in Victoria Park in 1978. So they would be there in struggle together, defending the communities, defending themselves. And I think this is absolutely necessary at times. At the same time, I think it's a bit gratuitous to always say, oh, you know, I want to punch a Nazi. It's not serious. It's not. I don't think this is serious. Politics is a certain kind of grandstanding and so on. But when it comes down to it, when they attack you in the streets, you've got to be there and you've got to meet them. And there are many such examples in the United States and UK of Jewish communities, for example, in the 1930s, Battle of Cable Street, I think it was in East End of London, fighting the black shirts and Mosley. This is absolutely necessary, but it's not ultimately our politics on the left. It's not our politics.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the things that you overlook, I suppose, that one overlooks when it immediately becomes like, oh, well, I just want to go and punch a Nazi, is what are the social conditions that give rise to that? What are the conditions, alienating conditions, the feeling of desperation, and so on and so forth, that creates a situation in which people feel like all of this stuff is happening to them. They see, employment opportunities disappearing, or were never there in the first place, so on and so forth. And then they are told by some demagogue or other, I mean, you fill in your favorite name here, fill in the blank with your favorite name here, that it's the fault of these people over here. And so, what are the and in those situations, if someone is desperate enough, it's not that much of a rhetorical trick to convince them that they should blame this group or that group or whatever.
Exactly.
And so I think that's one of the things that gets lost when the first place you go is, well, let's go and punch some Nazis in the head. But that said, I think that, and this is kind of the last thing that I wanted to get you to talk a little bit about. One of the things that is, as you know, that many people will be familiar with this, is brought up as a reason for cancel culture, a reason for deplatforming, is, well, it's always the idea of free expression, the idea of academic freedom over and over and over again is always mobilized in favor of, protecting noxious opinions, racism, sexism, whatever, like, the usual suspects. And so therefore there needs to be some strict limits. We need to have some guidelines. Maybe we need to do away with it altogether, because that's the only way that we're going to get rid of the kind of speech that then makes people feel comfortable perpetuating that kind of speech, and then going even further. So what is your proposal, I suppose, for dealing with that situation where the idea, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why you and I and Jim, for example, are not libertarians, because the idea of free expression being just sort of a kind of a negative good, that if you just remove all restrictions, that's the way forward. Well, that doesn't seem very satisfactory to people who are in favor of deplatforming and cancel culture, and frankly, it doesn't seem very satisfactory to me, and I know it doesn't seem very satisfactory to you as well. So why not? What's missing in that position that just says, well, we should just remove all restrictions. Everybody should be able to say whatever they want, and it'll get hashed out in the marketplace of ideas, which I think is a horrible expression. Couldn't get it more wrong. But so if not that, then what?
Okay, great, Charles. It's very a good couple of questions there. And the way I would parse them is by saying the first part is really about academic freedom. And I would invite people to remember that a certain black radical communist woman was turfed from her job at UCLA.
Yeah.
And the guy who signed that letter of dismissal was Ronald Reagan, acting as the executive authority of the Board of Regents, the University of California Board of Regents. The woman was Angela Davis. So let's not forget that there was a witch hunt called McCarthyism in the United States, and its after effects went through the 1970s. So let's not take academic freedom lightly. Unfortunately, I think that younger colleagues of ours don't really seem to understand or appreciate how important it actually is. Again, we started this discussion with me saying I really became aware of how crucial it was back then, 7 years ago. Now it's even more important, because who does cancel culture the best? The very people who invented the term. Isn't that ironic? The right. The right calls out cancel culture, but they're the ones who do it the best. Of course, when they do it, it's not cancel culture, and that's common, in these debates and discussions. So the other question is more generally about freedom of expression. Of course, academic freedom, not everything goes, right? And I think there are some really significant limitations on academic freedom. Whereas when we talk about free expression more generally, especially in the United States, there's much more space for it, and the so-called marketplace of ideas, which I also have no use for as a term.
It couldn't be worse.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, I mean, there, in my view, the libertarian perspective, which emphasizes negative freedom, right? You're free insofar as you have fewer constraints placed upon your possibilities of action. That sort of untrammeled freedom of expression, ultimately, I think could be, one could argue, and I don't have the time to sort of lay out the argument here, but it's self-defeating, because it would create conditions within which the institutions required to maintain negative liberty would be undermined, if not destroyed. And then you don't have negative liberty in a state of chaos, in a state of permanent civil war. There's no liberty there. So that already says, well, in order to have freedom, we need institutions. So there's the idea of positive liberty, that is to say, freedom not against the law or outside of the law and institutions, but freedom through the institutions and the law that is genuinely made by the citizens who live under it, not in a condition of alienation from it as we live today, right? This is why a radical democratic politics has to or would entail this idea of freedom through rather than freedom from institutions. But the institutions would then themselves be properly democratized, so they reflect our will as citizens, right? And so that means in my position, and I think you and Jim might, I think you guys share the position, but I wouldn't want to speak for you in any case, and that is that it is not about limiting expression that people disagree with, maybe might be offended by, right? But are perhaps not harmed by. I think there's been a real overinflation of the idea of harm, which then provides a justification for limiting the universe of political, social, aesthetic, artistic discourse, right? So it's not about a move in the direction of limitation, other than when it actually is about incitement or harm, but rather than trying to redress some of the crucial inequalities in society, right? So we put on a panel at the Institute last week on Ferry Creek and had some people saying, well, you've got people who are speaking essentially in favor of the blockade. Why is industry and government not represented? And I respectfully responded, this was on Twitter, I respectfully responded by saying that, well, to say the least, industry and government already has their views quite widely known and disseminated, whereas we want to hear from these indigenous land defenders, elders, journalists, independent journalists, and lawyers whose voices don't get heard as much. And I think this is valid, and this is in the spirit of positive liberty. And I think that this nuance is often missed, because a couple of years ago I said, well, we should organize something, a panel on freedom of speech, and somebody on the steering committee of the institute said, oh no, I can't be involved in that at all. So, well, you didn't even let me finish my sentence about what we could or couldn't do and how it might look. And then I get a lecture about how people of color, I suppose I'm included in that, I don't know, have no freedom of speech. And I found that profoundly unsettling, as you can imagine. Yeah. So that brings us maybe back to the theme of, well, the title of our
No, exactly. So I think that that's really great, and I mean it puts me in mind very quickly, because I want to turn to questions from the audience, but it does put me in mind of this expression, which I think in some ways is becoming a bit threadbare at this point, but nonetheless I think quite powerful. The idea that privilege often experiences equality as oppression. And so when you say, well, what we want to do is create institutional structures that will give voice to groups that historically have not had the same access to free expression as some other groups, that comes to seem as discriminatory or oppressive, precisely because it's of the context, I suppose. So let's do that. Let's turn to the audience and see if we've got any questions that you can respond to. So, Ange, do we have some questions that we can?
Yeah. I do want to remind the audience that they can use the Q&A button to ask questions now, if they would like. The first question is from Spencer, and Spencer asks, do we as people need to accept that race and racism is embedded in our society and the reality of privilege and power?
Very good question, Spencer. Thank you. Well, it depends on what you mean by accept. We could say that we can accept it on an analytic level, that there is a relationship between these things. So as a statement of fact, yes, these things exist. But we shouldn't accept it morally and politically. That is to say, we need to transform society in such a way as to ameliorate and eventually end racism. And if racism comes out of privilege and power, which I think it does, which is why we need a kind of anti-capitalism at the heart of our anti-racist struggles, then we need to transform society such that the conditions that give rise to racism are themselves eliminated. Thank you.
Ange, what do we have next?
The next question is from Celine, and Celine says, you said earlier that anti-racism without anti-capitalism cannot succeed. Can you explain why this is the case?
Yeah, thanks. Just to go back to some of the things I said earlier, if we understand capitalism as having very much within it a kind of inbuilt racism, and this is something that Cedric J. Robinson, who's written on the radical black tradition, has called racial capitalism. If we look at the very origin of capitalism in conquest and in the expropriation of indigenous lands, and of course transatlantic slave trade, as a basis for what Marx called primitive accumulation, which Glenn Coulthard reminds us is not something that just happened one time, it is ongoing. There's a kind of primitive nature to capitalism, which paradoxically and in a very racist way labels the very indigenous peoples whose lands are expropriated primitive, right? So primitive accumulation actually creates the conditions where those whose lands are expropriated are understood to be primitive. The irony should escape no one. So in order for us to then properly transform society such that we confront racism, then we need to transform capitalism because we live in a capitalist society. Thanks for the question.
Ange, what's next?
The next question is from Robert, and Robert asks, issues of identity and identity politics are essential to be able to be discussed and explored if we are serious about moving towards social justice. Could you comment on the apparent contradictions that to be taken seriously, one often must be able to invoke identity to criticize identity politics?
That's such a good observation, and one that certainly hadn't escaped Jim, Charles, and myself. Indeed. At the same time, I mean, it might seem a little hypocritical. Well, you're criticizing the very thing you're relying upon to make your criticism stick, right? Or maybe at its worst, you're insulating yourself from criticism of your own criticism, right? But if you recall, in response to Charles's question about some kind of counter category to identity, I said I didn't think there was one. That we need these categories, certainly, but we shouldn't fetishize them. And I think that engages in exactly what you were asking for, right? Which is to say, we need a fulsome discussion of identity and identity politics, which I think I'm engaging in here, by saying, yes, we need certain identity categories. Some are not like the others, like class is not like, sexual orientation. Although they're kind of, layered on one another when it comes to intersectionality, I think. And so we need to have that discussion. I'd like to see more of it. But I think that in our climate now, there's quite a reluctance to do so for fear of misunderstanding or fear of people, let's say, willfully misunderstanding others. But thank you. That's a really great comment/question.
So we're answering the questions, but they're maybe accumulating slightly more quickly than we're answering them, which is good. But I do want to pick up on a little bit on this last answer and on one of the comments you made a moment ago, because I think it's an important point. But the issue of class and the issue of identifying with a class. And I guess what I wanted to just ask you a little bit about was certainly for some people, and there's a long, and I think one might even say illustrious isn't quite the right word, but celebrated history of identification with different levels of class. And I don't mean, the aristocracy or the haute bourgeoisie or whatever, but rather, with, for example, the working class. And that for, not everybody who is in, either the urban or rural working classes, for example, I mean, for many people historically, identifying with those classes has been absolutely a point of pride and fundamental to how they see themselves and who they see themselves as being. And so I wonder if you want to sort of flesh out a little bit that category, because you seem to be very clear that that's a category, that's a system of categories that we can dispense with. But certainly for some people that would be taking away a crucial part of who they are and how they see themselves. Maybe I misunderstood you. Oh
yeah, let me clarify that. I wasn't saying that we dispense with class. Is that how you understood me? That we dispense with?
Something like that.
Oh no, rather what I was trying to suggest, very much along the lines of a certain episode of Seinfeld, where Elaine, looking from economy to first class, right? Jerry's sitting in first class, and she gets kicked out, I think, for the third time or something. She goes, our aim should be a society without classes. Of course, she wanted to be in first class, you know. But I think this is really the radical thrust of Marxism, isn't it? That the aim of socialists and communists is the creation of a classless society. So that's what I mean by the end of class, the end of class division, the social ownership of the means of production and property, public property, and so on. So this is what I mean. And if our politics reflects perhaps a kind of reification of society, that maybe the best we can do is be included within a society that is in the process of destroying itself, that's a pretty thin sort of politics, right? So we need to think beyond that. So that's what I meant. But I would also like to say that the radical black tradition here is still so vibrant and has so much to teach us today, and that is especially, I invoked Angela Davis already, whom I'm teaching in my Humanities 101, and the students seem to really love her. Right. But also the importance of Fred Hampton, about whom a film was recently made, Judas and the Black Messiah, which is fantastic because it shows just on the cusp of building community. Again, this is a left politics. It's not about violence in the streets. It's about building and strengthening communities. And that's what they were in the process of doing, discussing the very night that the FBI came and murdered him and his comrades. And what did he want? He wanted to build cross-racial alliances based on class, right? We're workers, we're poor, we have ultimately the same interests against those who really control the levers of power, right? And I think that sort of politics has to come back. And within the fetishized categories of certain forms of identity politics, I can't imagine how that would even be possible.
Okay, so I just wanted to make sure you weren't overlooking the dignity of labor. That's all.
Not at all. Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite.
Ange, what do we have next?
The next question is from Marco. Samir, you said we cannot cancel our way to alliance building. Could you elaborate and perhaps give an example where that has happened and is harmful?
Okay, here's an example that actually gets back to the question of class, and that is that a few months ago, Adolph Reed Jr., who is a veteran activist, political organizer in the African American community in the United States, also now I think a professor emeritus of political science, a political philosopher and political scientist, was invited to speak at an event that was co-hosted, I believe, by the New York and Philadelphia DSA, so Democratic Socialists of America, and he was canceled. And the basis for this was class reductionism. And as I've said, elsewhere, and but I kind of like the joke, so I'll say that, how can any socialist organization worth its salt disavow at least a certain amount of class reductionism? But more to the point, how can we have, as I also just said, cross-racial alliances based on class in the context in which people are rushing to cancel one another on what seem to me and to many others to be specious grounds? I didn't like what you said, or you don't have a right to say that, you don't have a right to that pain, as opposed to looking at what can be built. And the other thing, last point, and I know there are others who want to get in, Freddie DeBoer is a cultural critic based in the States and based in Brooklyn, I think, and he said something like, and it was a version of what I said earlier that Charles quoted, but I really like the formulation, that isn't it interesting that there, many of those who are in favor of police abolition themselves behave like cops in relationship to other activists, right, and other organizers. How, in that context, can alliances be built? I think it's very difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah. Terrific. So what's next, Ange?
Yeah, the next question is, what are your views on the balance between breaking down, eliminating racial barriers to recognize everybody as simply human beings, and openly recognizing race in order to celebrate diversity and gain a better understanding of how to overcome prejudice?
Oh, that's
Great.
yeah, that's a terrific question. You know, I think that would require a very long and detailed answer, but I would just emphasize some of the things that I've said already. That, you know, an anti-racism without a transformative vision, if anti-racism is just simply a kind of managerial technique to make corporations work more smoothly, or universities to be somewhat less conflict-ridden, that's not going to help us. It's only going to keep us in our various silos. And if you know, if you've read White Fragility, you'll see the way in which, you know, Robin DiAngelo talks about going right to her white colleagues to express feelings of unease and so on if she's, you know, perhaps insulted or offended a person of color. I mean, it is really quite extraordinary. I don't see that as any kind of way forward. What I do see is that people come together in conditions of solidarity when they're struggling for the same kinds of things, be it for a new contract, or against the racism, or against racists and white supremacists who are embattling their communities, etc. When people are together on the front lines fighting for the same things, that's when understanding can happen, and that has to be the basis of some kind of future. That would be the short answer.
Ange, what's next?
Yeah, the next question is from Ian. Ian says, it seems to me that some of the issues can be focused with a quick contrast. In the 1960s, liberal society was more or less triumphant, and the left could criticize liberal values and institutions without worrying too much. Now, with fascist tendencies in the ascendance and the possibility that liberal values and institutions may be abolished, the left has to both defend the gains of liberal institutions while also criticizing their limitations. Can you comment on this, please?
Ian, thank you. That's a wonderfully perceptive and helpful comment. I think it's useful, but I'd say only to a point, insofar as, depending on who you ask, maybe those struggles for, let's say, the inclusion of certain groups and the achievement of what we know today as liberal democracy, on which you've written so brilliantly yourself in Emergent Publics. Maybe those struggles were still underway in the 60s, and that the dust hadn't settled quite yet, and maybe the dust was never really given a chance to settle, because then we get into the period in the late 60s and early 70s of increasing conflict and socioeconomic crisis. So maybe that moment of liberal democracy at its kind of apogee, where the left could tilt at it a bit more comfortably, maybe that didn't really fully quite exist. But maybe we can discuss this at another time. But thanks very much for your question/comment.
I think we've got time for just a couple more questions. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of the questions that are waiting for us, but we'll see how we go. So what's next, Ange?
The next one is from Carlene. Carlene asks, what recommendations do you have for educators or healthcare providers who are facing institutional structural racism and iterative microaggressions and erasure? I've been encouraging colleagues to take Resmaa Menakem's, sorry if I'm not saying that properly, somatic abolitionist therapy for self-care, and to connect with a forward-thinking support group for allyship and strategizing, but it is clearly weighing down on those in leadership or service professions during COVID. What is your take on keeping racialized psyche, bodies, and jobs safe from a police state and colonized workspace?
Very interesting question. I think a difficult one, and I think all the things you mentioned about self-care are really important, especially in your sector, in your field. I mean, it seems the pressures are mounting on healthcare workers. The dangers have always been there, from the beginning, but have been accelerated and magnified by the pandemic. the kind of rancor directed against healthcare workers by the anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers, some of whom, small proportion, but it's surprising that there's a certain proportion of healthcare workers who are themselves against vaccines, etc. So I think all these things would lead me to say, yes, self-care is really important, but I worry about the discourse of self-care as being a little bit too focused on an individualized approach. I think that there has to be collective action, there's got to be organizing. If there's a union, work with your union. Unions themselves are not free of systemic racism, of course, but that has to be addressed, right? If there's no union in place, try to organize one. I think those collective solutions are always going to be more effective. I hesitate also before the language of allyship. I think it's appropriate to nations. So, Canada is part of a North Atlantic alliance, sadly, but it makes sense for Canada to have allies as a country, as a nation, right? It makes sense for Indigenous nations to enter into alliances, right? To think about allyship and to maintain their sovereignty. But when we as groups and individuals think about allyship, are we saying that we are like nations, that we're like states? Is this our politics? Or is there a politics of solidarity, which is also the politics of the labor movement, that is really vital? So that would be my short answer. But thank you. That's a wonderful insight into where you're coming from and the difficulties and the challenges that you face. Thank you.
Yeah, I think your point, Samir, about allyship versus solidarity, I mean, I think that's just a terrific.
It's not mine, by the way. It's Jodie Dean, her book on the Comrade. This is a very important argument of it, so I should have mentioned that. I was referring.
I think it's terrific. Ange, what's next?
Yeah, the next one is from Alex. Alex says, you mentioned that the right is the one who calls out cancel culture, but are the ones who do it the best. Can you elaborate and give some examples?
Oh boy. There was the case, and Jim would know the details way better than I, but there was the case of this woman who specialized in human rights abuses by Israel against the Palestinian people, who had been hired for a job at U of T, and then she was let go, or maybe the hiring didn't fully take place. It was quashed at the last minute. I'm not exactly sure of the details. But this was a huge academic freedom issue, very much motivated by the right, motivated by those who would favor the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism. And the university was censured as a result. The university was, in a sense, punished by COT and so on, the Canadian Association of University Teachers. So that would be an egregious example. There are many such examples. Stephen Salaita was very similar, a Palestinian academic who was let go, who was hired and then unhired because of some tweets that he had sent out. Gio Mar is another figure. There are many. There are many such cases. Yeah.
We got time for a couple more, I think. So, Ange, what's next?
Yeah, the next question is from an attendee, and they say, I'm a contributor to Jacobin. Myself and some other writers see their political trajectory as a blanket rejection of identity politics. But in doing so, they fetishize white male workers as the working class, turning class into another form of identity politic. Do you notice this trend on the left?
Yeah, I've certainly seen it. I've seen it because I have also followed some of the debates in and around Jacobin, in social media and so on. I'm not sure it's as great a problem here in Canada. I might be wrong, but I think the Canadian left has been, especially the last 10, 15 years, much more receptive to voices that go beyond the white working class. But I have to say as well, I think there's some importance to also trying to include the white working class. Again, that doesn't mean making it into a fetish, but I think that there's been a shift in the opposite direction, where it seems the left, in some ways, agrees with what Hillary Clinton said about the basket of deplorables. That is not a left politics. And I think if we get so caught up in about how, in how people present, and maybe that you don't use the right language, maybe they are a bit offensive, maybe they're, quite difficult to deal with, maybe they manifest racism. What do you do with that? How do you address this? And my question to colleagues and friends is, how about especially members of the white working class or even middle class who come, as especially young men come to the university, right? And they're interested in politics, but they don't really know their way around it, but they want to know more, and they show up to a left organization, a student group, and so on, and they're right away told to sit down and shut up. Well, what's going to happen? Are they going to stick around, or are they going to go elsewhere? And where is it that they go? So I think maybe sometimes the identity politics that we see that wants to transform society, to make it a better society, to make it anti-racist, to make it sort of a society that's no longer racist, tends to inadvertently do things that only worsen the problem. I think this would be a hypothesis of mine. Anyway, thank you.
And Ange, do we have a short one, or maybe one that would prompt a short answer?
I'll do my best. The next question: do you think the effects of invisible racism versus hate crime, for example, vary?
Oh well, I think the question is a bit too vague. I mean, if you gave specific examples, I think that would be one thing, but I couldn't comment. It's just too open-ended, too vague. Sorry.
Okay, so maybe one last question, Ange. Is there something that really addresses an issue that we haven't touched on, or something like that? I think we could probably fit in one last one before we close.
Why do you feel there is this is from Jenna, why do you feel there is so little reference to, and often hostility to, reference to class in many anti-racist initiatives?
Yeah, very good question. Because I think, a lot of anti-racist initiatives, those coming from corporations, for example, or dominant institutions like universities, are just not interested in addressing class, because to address class is then to address questions of the working conditions of sanitation workers on campus, for example, or in the corporation, the employees of those organizations, and so on. I mean, this was a big thing at SFU because EDI is an important initiative of our new president. At the same time, there's been a kind of reluctance to improve the working conditions of the cafeteria workers, who tend to be overwhelmingly racialized and women, right? So EDI is understood in a very kind of restricted way, which prevents it from really going in the direction of addressing, material conditions of labor, which is where it needs to go if it's going to address anti-racism in any meaningful way, I think.
That's great. I mean, I think that's probably where we're going to have to leave it. Unfortunately, we've still got a couple of questions left, but I think that we probably have to leave it there, unless, Ange, you think we have time for one last question.
Well, we could do another question.
Okay.
And turn it over to Jim.
Okay.
Yeah, the next one. When you said that racism is embedded in the society because of slavery and colonization, what are your thoughts on racism today, as it is more of a social pressure or pressure from higher authorities, which is somewhat spreading racism in the communities with itself, like within people of the same race?
Okay, yeah, terrific question. So the two aren't unrelated, right? It's a legacy of slavery that people within communities descended from from African societies, African cultures are having to contend with, and of course ongoing settler colonialism. We can just talk about what's happening now at Fairy Creek. We can talk about what's happening in the northern part of BC and Wet'suwet'en territory and so on. It's a very real situation. But I think my answer to your question, and I've written about this a little bit, is to be found in the notion of an identification with the aggressor. And you could say that colonialism would have not have been possible without certain privileged groups within, say, Indian society or certain African societies or certain East Asian societies actually throwing their lot in with the colonizer and not challenging him, but rather, identifying with the aggressor. Some identify with the aggressor and are repaid handsomely for that. Others only maybe receive a psychological reward for that. And I think the psychoanalytic dimension here we haven't even gone into, but I would recommend Frantz Fanon, his work on the process of decolonization, decolonizing struggles, which he understands not just as an activist, as a writer, as a philosopher, but also as a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. And he studies these mechanisms of identification.
And there's one last question left. Do you think we have time to fit that in before we bring Jim back?
Okay, the next question from Natalie. How can a country guard itself carefully from fascist-like conditions?
It's a great one.
Yeah, it is. It is a great one. Yeah, I mean, I think that one reason why people fall prey to fascism isn't just what we've been talking about, a kind of, violent form of racism where you want to subjugate the other. But I think that there's also the dimension of feeling of powerlessness. And so participation, however that participation may look, in a dominant group is a way of addressing, in a false way, that sense of powerlessness. So I would say, and that we could start doing this right now, is to empower people, not just in, as citizens, participating in representative democracy, but getting back to the question from the healthcare worker, empower people in their workplaces, right? Empower people in their jobs, in the universities, in the classrooms. Give people power, and they will be less likely to want to participate in a false form of power, which is what fascism offers.
I think that's a great place to end. So I'm glad we found an opportunity to fit in that last question. I guess turn it over to Jim.
Well, I really want to thank the two of you for I thought, a terrific discussion and analysis of issues and responding to a variety of interesting questions. I was quite impressed with the audience and their questions. And it was hard sitting here in the background, because when the question was asked about examples of the right canceling, I can give a very long list as you began. If anybody wants to contact me at the Center for Free Expression, we'd be happy to provide you more examples. So thank both of you very much. I thought it was a wonderful, stimulating discussion. And I want to thank the audience for your being here and for your engagement with this conversation. Terrific questions that were asked. A video of today's conversation is going to be posted on our website either tomorrow afternoon or Friday morning. So if you found it interesting, feel free to let people in your network know about it. They can see it. Our website address is cfe@ryerson.ca. Now, next week's event is going to be a week tomorrow, Wednesday, October 27th at 4 p.m. It's a very different subject. Its title is Publication Bans versus Press Freedom in Open Courts. As you know, in Canada, the open court principle is a cornerstone of our legal system. And the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court, has reaffirmed the stringent conditions for any judge considering whether to limit what can be reported to the public from a courtroom. But in practice, publication bans are often granted on scant arguments or evidence. We have an impressive panel, including a judge, some lawyers on both sides, journalists, who will be exploring what this means for journalists, for press freedom, for the public's right to know, and for the integrity of our legal system. For more information about this event, as well as the upcoming events after that, or videos of our past events, again, go to our website, cfe.ryerson.ca. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Goodbye.